session tonight is going to examine the issue of social conflict. This is session 8 in the lecture series, and by this point in time we've begun to look and understand some of the key dimensions of leadership in relationship to society. Last week we saw how David was recruited to become the leader in Israel. We looked at some of the rules of the game that were part of his work and how he had to do his job. Tonight we're going to see him in crisis and in failure. As we look at leadership crisis, there are a variety of temptations that a leader faces. Tonight we're going to consider the temptation of self-pity. In David's life there were two critical issues that affected him and moved him to an attitude of self-pity. The first was the situation with Bathsheba when the child that was born to him died, and David grieved greatly because of that child. The second was the situation with his son Absalom. And the scriptures tell us that when Absalom killed his brother Amnon, that David was deeply distressed. In fact, that he mourned for Amnon. And then we see in 2 Samuel chapter 13 that Absalom fled from David, and David had lost both of his prized sons. In chapter 13, verse 38, it says, Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and he stayed there 3 years. And verse 39 is instructive because it tells us the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. Now this issue of David longing to go to Absalom is something that he felt like he could not do. And we find that this was a crippling factor in his leadership. In fact, it was so crippling that chapter 14 tells the story of how Joab tried to get Absalom reconciled again with David because he saw that it was just impairing David's leadership ability. To understand this, of course, you have to understand that David loved Absalom, he loved Amnon, he'd lost 2 of his beloved sons, and he was not really consoled in this. We also have that kind of thing happen in our lives. One of the things that often happens with missionaries is that they will train up a leader and that leader will fail, will be an Absalom. And the missionary then will grieve for that leader. We remember last week we talked about Samuel grieving for Saul. The whole idea of grieving for a leader is really what we see happening in David's life here. And he began to pity himself. He began to lose concentration in terms of what it meant to be king. We're going to find in our lectures tonight that this was devastating for David. It led to his complete irresponsibility in terms of his role as judge over all of Israel, and Absalom really stole the loyalty of the people from him because of it. As we think then about our role as Christian leaders, I think it's important to realize that pity, self-pity, about crisis in our family, about crisis in the leaders that we train, can become a real detriment to our effective leadership. It certainly happened in David's life, and it can happen in ours as well. Reflect on that as you look at tonight's session and on what it means to be a leader and the temptations that you will face in that process. Good evening. Hey, good. All right, tonight we're on lecture 15. The title is Maintaining and Losing Support, and we're on page 39 in the syllabus. Maintaining support is the key to successful leadership. If people follow you, you're in good shape. If they don't follow you, you're not such an effective leader. And that's true, of course, of people that we train for leadership in other cultural situations. Keeping support is really a key agenda if you're going to be effective in leadership. Of course, losing support is something that happens as well. You do things that people don't like and they withdraw their support. They pull out and say, I won't follow you anymore. And so tonight we're going to look at the issues of getting support and losing it and see what we can learn about that and how it can help us to train people and to be ourselves more effective in leadership. Last week we talked about the transactional nature of leadership relationships. And you remember we talked about transactions as exchange, the kind of things that happen when you do something for me, I do something for you. People who follow a leader expect something back. And of course, they feel that they're giving something when they follow you. They're giving their allegiance, they're working with you, they're cooperating, they're supporting what you want to do. So the relationships between leaders and followers is something that is transactional in nature. if we can think about this, then tonight we'd like to take a look at what are some of the key things that are part of the transactions. How do you keep support as a leader, and how do you lose it by doing things that will break that bond and relationship? As we think about this tonight, the first thing that we're going to look at is the idea of satisfying demands. As you look at the the kind of connections that you have between leaders and followers, everybody has something they're interested in. You work together in a group, you work together in a team, you have goals. You remember we talked about political goals when we talked about political leadership. Goals are an important part of leadership. Public goals, we said. And so as we look at public goals, we're trying to then identify what it is that people want, what they're aiming for, what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes individuals have goals that are not exactly the same as the public goals. And so they evaluate then the situation in terms of whether these goals are in their interest or whether they're not. Right now we're in the midst of an election campaign. If you turn on the television in the evening, you'll find every night in the news there are discussions about whether Mr. Clinton or Mr. Bush is going to satisfy the voters' demands. And the voters are concerned about particular issues. They're concerned about the economy. Okay, why is the economy such a big concern? Because we as individuals have goals. We want security in our jobs. We want to have improvement in our personal standard of living. We'd like to see our income go up instead of go down. We want to be able to provide for our families in ways that we feel will be satisfying to us. So, the debate right now is whether or not either of these candidates can help the American people fulfill their goals. And this is all related to satisfying demands. Now, the easiest way to get support is to give people what they want. That is the easiest way to get it. If you can do that, you'll be very, very fortunate, and you'll have a lot of people happy with you and following you. I can tell you right now that 90% of my problems would be over if I could give every faculty member a reduction in teaching load, if I could give every faculty member a bonus in salary, if I could provide for every faculty member a computer in their office. I mean, if I could do all of those things for them, my problems are over. You know, they'll be so happy, they'll be ecstatic. They'll say, hey, this guy is the greatest leader we've ever had here at Biola. Now I don't have the money, so I can't do it. I can't satisfy their demands. I can't fill that. So, what's left? You know, where do I have to go? And it's a challenge to know exactly where to go next. We had a meeting today, and in that particular meeting, I walked up to one table and I said, anybody here have any questions, anything that you'd like to ask me or any way that we can interact? First guy said, I'd like to have a raise. And say, that's great, talk to this guy over here. And went to another table, and the first person that spoke to me, I asked that same question. He says, well, he said, I'd really like to have a sabbatical. I said, well, talk to this person over here. I'm not in the position to give either of them a raise or a sabbatical. I don't have the money to do it. I couldn't satisfy their demands. So, as you look at the role of leadership, if you can satisfy people's demands, it's a pretty easy street. But if you can't satisfy their demands, then you've got to work at other strategies. Now, the second thing that we have here is the idea of influence. And influence really is gaining compliance. Now, gaining compliance sounds bad. It doesn't sound very exciting. It doesn't, to get people to go along with you. Usually, if you try to get support through influence, what you're trying to do is to convince people that what you want to do is in their interest. That your objective and your goals are going to help them. Now, this is really where Clinton and Bush are right now. They are trying to influence people, trying to convince them that their particular agenda is in the interest of the American people. They know very well that they can't satisfy the American people's demands. If Bush could do it, he'd do it tomorrow. He wants to be elected. Because if he could make sure that everybody had a job, if he could somehow sure that everybody got a raise, he would have done that a long time ago. But he doesn't have the power to do that. It's not within his resources or within the resources of his government to do it. So he's working on gaining compliance. Somehow getting people to believe that his program is in their best interest. Now, this agenda is again one that I've tried with a varying degree of success. How do you convince people that your plan and your program really is in their interest over a longer period of time? A couple of years ago, we talked about retention. I went around campus saying to everybody, hey, we've really got to work on this issue of retaining the students that come. Said that if we can do that, our enrollment problems are solved. That if we can keep more of the students who come and get them to, just serve them so well that they don't want to leave, then the new ones that we bring in, we keep serving them at that level, our enrollment will go up. Well, that worked for a year. And people really worked hard at it for a year, and we had better retention that year. But the next year, kind of fell back into the old way again. Our retention dropped. It wasn't as good as it was the year before. And this past year, it was even worse yet. So we got to paint the walls and move the furniture and have the talk again and try to get people once again to say, hey, retention is really a primary agenda. We've got to work on that. We've got to serve the customers that we have the very best of our possible ability. And try to convince people it's in their best interest to make this a very high priority and to work their hardest to do this for the university. Now, that kind of thing is trying to help people to get on board with the agenda that you think is going to help meet their needs. But if they don't buy into your program, if they don't feel that this is going to satisfy them, then you'll fail on that level. Influence usually involves using your position of power and using your position of prestige to get people to come along. We talk about influential people. People who are able to convince others to follow because they are somebody. They have some recognition. Now, what I've found when I go overseas is that I'm always an influential person. Not because of the fact that I'm really worthy of it at all, but just because I happen to be an American. I can remember when I was in Cameroon back in 1978. Every man who had an interest in going to the college in the United States came up and talked to me and would do anything I asked, because I was from the State University of New York, and they all believed that I could get them a scholarship to go to the State University of New York. So they thought I was a very powerful man, that I would have influence, that I could help them get what they wanted. Well, it was one of those things. You can be tempted to use that. If you don't ever want to go back there again, play it for all it's worth, And then you leave and you don't do anything for them, and they say, that guy was a jerk, we'll never do anything for him again, and wipe him off the map, and it's all over. But if you want to keep working with those people, it doesn't last long. It's one of those things. Pretty soon they see that you really can't produce. So influence is trying to produce results for the people that you have with the reputation and the power that you have. If you can't influence people to get their compliance, then you have to resort to persuasion. Now, persuasion can be friendly. It can be unfriendly. It can be using the powers of reason. It can be using your powers of oratory. The difference between influence and persuasion is, instead of trying to tell them that what you're going to do is really in their interest, persuasion is to get them to change their minds, to get them to believe what you believe instead of what they believe. Now, persuasion is a harder task. In other words, if you're trying to say, my agenda really will help you accomplish what you want, you're not trying to change their agenda. But persuasion is basically saying your agenda really misses the mark. You need to change your agenda. You need to think about new things. You need to look at new directions. You think that it's not good for you to have increase in taxes, but I want to tell you that it's best for you to pay more taxes. If you paid more taxes, then everything is going to get better. Now, that takes persuasion. And it's interesting, most of our candidates are not trying to persuade people of that. Ross Perot is trying it. He says, we've got to have more taxes. Now, he's trying to shape it in such a way that he gets the most people not having taxes, and the people that aren't in the largest majority would be the ones that would be subject to the tax, and his plan is a little bit like that. But the key thing in persuasion is really changing people's minds. This is much harder than gaining compliance. Much harder. Because in this, you've got to get those people to rethink what they're doing and be convinced that what you are saying is the best way to go about it. Now, one of the things that I've learned in this process is that persuasion takes much longer. Persuasion takes personal contact. It takes dialogue. It takes continuous interaction with people so that they can reason with you to a point of reaching a new understanding. Influence is something you can do on television. It's something you can do in public meetings. It's something you can try. If you know where people are and you know what they want, you can work to use your influence to somehow get them to believe that what you're going to do fits with them. And they'll go along with you in hopes that it's going to work out the way they want. But really, to get them to do something they think is not good, to get them to say we're willing to increase taxes, to get them to say that we're willing to make sacrifices for the good of everybody, it takes a lot of persuasion and a lot of confidence in the leadership. So it's a much harder level to work at and a much more difficult thing to accomplish. The last issue is coercion. And coercion is force. Okay? Force means using power, using some means that you have to make people comply with what you want them to do. Now, there are ways of forcing people without exactly hitting them or using weapons or something like that. You can set up a standard that they will not get rewarded unless they fulfill the objectives of the standard. So then they're forced to either comply with that standard and work toward that goal, or they don't get rewarded. They don't get promoted or whatever it might be. You can use the public pressure on them. You can use public force to try to get them to comply with what you want to do. For example, if you have a majority and the majority says that we're going to beat up the minority if they don't come along with us, then the minority feels coerced and they have to come along. Or if the majority has the ability to create tremendous pressure on a minority, then that can work in that way. Coercion really is the last way to try to get support. The use of coercion sometimes can come from the power that you have and the position that you have. For example, if you are the head of the mission, or if you are the head of a mission team, you can say that I have authority, I have control over the resources, and if you don't support us, we'll just dismiss you from the team and send you back. And if they have that power, then you either have to comply or you're dismissed from the team and sent back home. Sometimes people use that kind of force. It's interesting, I remember the very first decision I had to make when I took this job of provost. I tried satisfying the demand of the follower. That didn't work. I tried influencing the follower. That didn't work. I tried persuading the follower, and that didn't work, and I was left with only one thing left, you know. I order you to do this. No, I didn't want to do that. But it was a situation, it was a crisis. You know, it was one of those things where the one person had appealed the process, the faculty appeals committee had heard it, the faculty appeals committee decided on behalf of one person, and the other person who happened to be the head of a particular division said, no, I won't go along with that. And so basically I had the faculty appeals committee or this person reporting to me, and I had to overrule the person reporting to me by force. I'm sorry, whether you go along with it or not, you will. And the person said to me point blank, you tell me that I have to do it, I'll do it, but otherwise I'm not going to do it. So there was no choice. In other words, you have force coercion the last step. Well, in this kind of a situation, you see, leadership sometimes requires the use of coercion. I mean, I was given no other choice as a leader. I was told, I will not do this unless you order me to. And so I said, I order you to. You have to do it because I'm in authority over you. Well, it's not good to be put in that kind of position. No one likes to be in that position, or at least not many leaders like to be in that position. The use of force here in America in particular is something that we don't relish as something that we really prefer to do. On the other hand, there are some people in business that love using force. In fact, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal today about a businessman who was the head of a very, very large international corporation. And the article said that this man is very quick to use force and uses it ruthlessly with people that work for him. So Some people are very effective as leaders and utilize force in a way that makes the job happen and gets done what they want to get done. So what happens then between leader and follower? This kind of transactional relationship has those 4 dimensions. Now as we look at the case studies that we're going to see tonight, we're going to look at how David gained support and how he lost support. What are some of the dynamics of how he did it? I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and talk about new leaders and how new leaders can be trained and how they can become more effective in terms of gaining support. What do we mean by new leaders? Well, we can talk about pastors, teachers. I've been involved with Wycliffe for many years. We can talk about translators, literacy workers. There are all kinds of new leadership positions that one can have. So when you're thinking about new leadership, you're talking about people who are going to be serving the church, serving the Christian community in some way, and they may be serving in new roles. These, in some situations, are new roles. For example, I've worked with tribal peoples down in Brazil. Okay, there were no pastors, teachers, and translators in any of these tribal areas. Other Wycliffe people have worked with tribal peoples in the Philippines. There were no teachers or translators. There may have been pastors in those situations, or there may have been pastors and teachers but no translators. And so there are certain kinds of roles that may be there before, but when you're going in and starting a new work, or you're working with people to develop new leaders, even though they may have seen the roles before, they're new personnel coming into those roles. So the idea of leadership is bringing new people into sometimes new positions and working with them. Now to accomplish that, there are some interesting things that we can observe that are helpful in this process. If you're going to be a leader, the first thing you need to keep in mind is that people are important. I have here in the notes, person as goal. I'm a task-oriented person. Be very upfront with you. Saul was a task-oriented person. He was really very interested in winning battles. When he got the word about the people at Jabesh Gilead, he was farming. He was out doing tasks. David was quite different. David was a people person. If you look at the story of David, David is always interacting with people. He's always talking to people. Even though he was out as a shepherd boy, David seems to have a real love for being with people. So they're quite different in their personalities. My point is, no matter what your personality is, if you're going to be a leader, you have to be interested in people. If you're not interested, you have to learn it. You have to commit yourself to being involved with people. You have to commit being interested in people and being person-oriented. If you aren't person-oriented, you're not going to be as effective. So one of the first things you have to do is get that person as goal focus in mind. Now, if you have identified somebody who you feel is somebody who's really gifted, somebody that the Lord is blessing, and somebody could be trained, but they're task-oriented, it's very important to help train them to learn to be sensitive to people. If you don't do that, they just won't do as well. They need to have that capacity. They need to have the ability to work with people. I worked with an Indian chief down in Brazil. He had only one arm. He was an incredible man, however. He, with one arm, did everything that every other man did. He went fishing, he went hunting, he cut down trees, he built houses. He did everything with his one arm. He lost a snake, poisonous snake bit him, the arm got gangrene, he had to have it amputated, but it didn't stop him. I watched him one day out in the jungle shoot with the bow and arrow. Put the arrow in his teeth, pull it out like this, bam. He was incredible. He was capable of doing any task that a man could do, but the reason the people liked him so much was he was person-oriented. He really loved people. He talked to people. He got interacting with people. He led people. He was a dynamic, personal leader. And it was his people skills, in addition to his just a tremendous drive to do everything other people could do with only one arm, that made him a very well-respected leader in that community. Now you need to understand this in the backdrop that with Indian peoples, anybody who's handicapped is usually left to die. They're excluded from the community. They're really not worth anything. So here's a man who's handicapped and who has the limitation, a significant limitation, who is the chief in the community because of his tremendous people skills and because of his indomitable spirit in terms of doing what he needed to do. Okay, let's go on. A second thing that's very important in terms of new leaders is to prepare them for the role. Preparing people for a role is especially important when the role is new, when people haven't done it before, when they don't really understand what it means to be a pastor, or they don't really understand what it means to be a teacher, or they don't really understand what it means to be a translator or a translation assistant. Getting prepared for roles is a crucial part of this training process. David was very well prepared. If you remember the story, he spent some time in the house of Saul, so he saw what it was like to grow up in the house of a king. He was a refugee, running away and being attacked. He lived in the house of a Philistine king, so he saw two kings from the inside. He was in the inside position, observing two powerful kings. Then he was a raiding war leader. He had a great deal of experience and exposure to the role before he was actually asked to be a king. And so he knew what was expected of kings when he went into that role. He was quite successful at it. On the mission field, if you take time to work with people and to teach them the role and take them through all the phases of it, and then give some time to live with it and work with it over a longer period of time, they'll be much more effective at it. I know ISCL has tried community development projects all over the world, and many of those workers have told me their projects have failed. I had one fellow tell me in Brazil, his name was John Hostetler, that the one project that was most successful is the one where the translator working with the guy took several years to work with him on acquainting him with the role. Doing a cooperative and how to do the co-op, and long time of working with that person in terms of explaining and training what the co-op was about, and that was successful. Not only do you need to teach them about the role, the third thing you need to keep in mind is that you need to teach them the context of new roles. Usually people don't understand the context that we come from. They don't know the framework out of which we do our work. Sue reminds me of this in terms of her stories about checking the Bible, the New Testament translation. Sue, when you tried to get people to do checking, how did they respond to it, and what was it that they didn't understand about the checking context?
We first tried to do have people do it on a regular basis, just individuals do reading of it, and that didn't work. Doing something consistently day by day, a couple hours a day, didn't work. When we got a bunch of people together doing it, over a 2-week period with lots of people doing it together, that's when we got the checking done. Okay.
It was basically the process of doing it in a group that made it make sense to them?
Yeah.
Okay. What about your team leader, Jimmy, and trying to get him to do this? Why was he resistant to it? Why didn't he understand this role, and how did you help him come through to seeing this as important?
Yeah, one of the checks that we had he had trouble understanding is why to do a check with people out in the village. And it was only when he saw it in the context of this is a great way to do evangelism by having people question and answer, which is a very cultural way for them to do evangelism and stuff, where they just go out, read the scripture, ask a question about it, and people can dialogue with them.
Okay. All right, now see, what Sue has told us is that until he had a context for it that made sense to him, he wasn't able to do it or wasn't willing to do it. And this is crucial to understand, that people need to have a context within which to play the role, a meaningful role, as they understand it. And if without that context, they really don't see that this makes sense, and they really have a difficult time getting themselves motivated to do it. Now, once he had defined that context, how did it go?
They did it for over a year and a half. Had like 300 people come to Christ through that ministry, and 4 churches planted during the time of the New Testament.
And what happened with the New Testament check?
We got it done.
Okay, great.
It was understood.
All right, see, that's the point I want to make in this whole process, that when people really have a context that's meaningful for them, and when they understand what they're doing, in that case, the translator checking his work in relationship to other people, and doing it in a framework, evangelism, which was his high goal and motivation, then it became something that really made sense to him, and he went at it with all his might. So as you think about the roles that you're working with, whatever it is that you're trying to train people to do, it's crucial to help them to understand a context. And if your context doesn't make sense, help to put it into their context. Help them define a context that really will make this role something that motivates them and brings them to satisfying their demands. You see, Jimmy was interested in evangelism. When checking satisfied that demand, he was all ready to do it. And I think that's a crucial thing to keep in mind for us, that's what motivates people to support. Now, the last thing I want to mention is continuing feedback. It's crucial to work with people, to give them feedback, to evaluate what you're doing, to engage in mutual dialogue. Sue, how much was that a part of what happened with you?
A lot of times, when I needed to talk with Jimmy, I just had to set aside like 5 hours for us to spend together every time I met with him, just to talk. And a lot of it was just sharing his vision. And then in those contexts, I could sometimes just introduce a new idea and see where it went.
Okay.
And sometimes he would contextualize it and it'd come out totally different.
Okay. And you let him go? Yeah. Okay, great. Sue's probably one of the greatest success stories I've ever seen in this, because what she did with those people is she worked with them, dialogued with them, but didn't try to run them. Released them to go ahead and do the ministry the way they need to do it. And it's really wonderful to see how God blessed that and how He used that. So oftentimes we want to drive people through a funnel. We want to shape them into what we think the ministry should be like. And if they don't do it the way we think it ought to be done, then we get frustrated. I know I do. I get frustrated. I think, oh, come on, why can't we get these people to do it the right way? And I have to constantly remind myself that, hey, there are many ways. There are many different ways to solve problems. There are many different styles of leadership. There are many people who have gifts that I don't have. And to be open and flexible to allow those people to work toward fulfilling those gifts is really a key. Well, I hope those give you some useful tips to think about as you look at the process of trying to train leaders. I want to now go to a case study and analyze how David lost support. In thinking about this tonight, we'll turn to 2 Samuel, and the key text that we'll be looking at is chapters 13 to 15. The background for this case study is rather a discouraging one. If you remember the story, David, first of all, got involved in sin. He saw Uriah's wife out in the house one evening, and she was bathing, she was beautiful, and so he decided he needed her. Now, David was already in trouble because his men were out fighting a war, and David was at home. So that tells you right away that David was not doing what kings should be doing, right? The kings were the ones who led in battle. David was at home on vacation, and that's how he got into trouble. He fell into sin with Bathsheba. You know what happened. He had problems with his daughter Tamar and his son Amnon. You know what happened there. We discussed that. Absalom was banished. And so David's had a whole series of family problems that have distracted him from his kingship, that have kept him from being the kind of leader that he needs to be. Now, in chapter 15 and verse 1, we find that his son Absalom is conspiring against him, to put it bluntly. It says, in the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Now that's important. Why is that important? Gaining support from where? People, but what people?
The people who support the king.
Okay. And when it says Israel here, what is it leaving out? Judah. Right. The people from Judah he didn't do this with, okay? Now, why not? Judah was his family, wasn't it? Judah was David's family. David is from the tribe of Judah. Okay? So he didn't do this with Judah, but with all the people from Israel, all the other tribes. He was out there and working on them. So he already knew that there was a problem that David had with loyalty from the rest of Israel. Judah he didn't have a loyalty problem with, but the rest of Israel, that's a place where Absalom could gain some ground. So the first thing that Absalom does then is he brings to himself symbols of power. You see him there, 50 men running ahead of him, getting up early in the morning, with his chariot, with his horses, standing beside the side of the road leading to the gate. And when he does this, he questions David's leadership. Okay? He says to them, "What town do you come from? Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then verse 3. Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." Now he's outside the city before they even get in, so that doesn't mean that what he's telling is true. But probably, because David was in the state of mind that he was, there was some truth in it. That David really wasn't being effective, that David wasn't doing the job. That's why Joab was concerned. That's why Joab tried to solve this problem. And so Absalom says, if only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case could come to me, and I would see that he gets justice. Okay? It's interesting as you look at this that Absalom's strategy was to target the people of Israel and to play on their rivalries with Judah and the need that they have for justice. And probably David's ineptness or David's lack of caring as to what really was going on in terms of justice under his own leadership. Absalom was successful at this. We find that his strategy was to get support, and verses 5 and 6 tells us he was successful. It says, when anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Remember what I said about personal contact? Personal relationship, being people-oriented? Absalom was a master. Okay? Then he said, Absalom behaved this way toward all the Israelites who had come as the king for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Okay? This is really the key thing. He stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He did it through personal relationships. He did it through appealing to their needs. He did it to satisfy their demands. If only I were king, I would satisfy your demands. I would take care of what your need is. Well, it's interesting that within a period of time, well, no, it says very specifically, verse 7, at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. Okay, this goes on for 4 years. Absalom was working it a long time. He was a patient man. He was very diligent in what he wanted to do. He was building support. I think therein is a good lesson itself. If you want support from people, you can't expect to do it in a day. You can't expect to do it in a couple of weeks. You can't expect to do it even in a year. Absalom took 4 years to do this, and he worked at it very steadily and consistently to gain this particular advantage. This is really a powerful lesson. And to me, this is just like a punch in the face. Wake up, Sherwood, wake up. If you want the support of people, you have to work at it diligently over a long period of time. And Absalom did it. Now, Absalom was corrupt. He was trying to establish a rebellion. But he worked hard at it. He worked at it diligently over a period of time. He then asked the king, let me go to Hebron, fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living in Geshur and Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. The king said, go in peace. So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel the Gileonite, David's counselor, to come down from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. Okay, it's interesting as you look at this, Absalom was very successful, and the story that we see follows is Absalom overthrowing the king and David fleeing into the wilderness. Now, the question I want to focus on in the next few minutes that we have remaining is, how did David lose support? What is it that brought him to this situation that Absalom became the king over Israel, and Absalom temporarily took away David's power and sent him running into the wilderness? The first thing that we are going to see is negligence. David really was negligent. Absalom, for 4 years at the city gate of Jerusalem, talked to these people and convinced them that they should follow him instead of David. Now, no matter how blind you are as a leader, surely in a 4-year period of time, somebody's going to come and tell you that your son is outside the city gate and that he's telling all the people that come in from Israel that there is no king for them, that there's no one to take care of their needs. This could not have been done in secret. David certainly could have found out about it. He knew surely that this was happening. And if he didn't, he was a lousy leader. He should have known. He should have been keeping track of this. He should have understood what was going on in Jerusalem. And not only in Jerusalem, but out in all of the rest of his territory. As king, he should have been concerned about the total political relationships of Israel and whether he was governing effectively. So in effect, he was blind to Absalom's activities, and he was negligent in terms of dealing with them, even if he knew about them. Some other aspects of this tell you that David had a rather long period of reigning in this particular way. Chapter 13:38 tells us that David spent 3 years mourning for Absalom. So that makes 7 years total already. 3 years in mourning for Absalom, then 4 years when Absalom's back in Jerusalem, undermining him at the gate, in which he didn't do anything about it and let his kingdom lapse into despair. And then verse 14, 28 to 33 says that there were 2 years of exile in Jerusalem in which Absalom didn't see David. And so it looks like that there was actually a 9-year period here in which David is kind of allowing things to go to pot. Now again, I think this is instructive, because what it tells us is that effective leaders don't die instantly. They die gradually over a long period of time. They continually fail to keep their responsibilities. They get swept up with other attitudes and other values, and over a long period of time, you suddenly find out that you're really not effective and you're not doing the job that you're called to do. Disaster didn't happen overnight then. It was something that took time to build up. Second thing that we can see is that David allowed personal problems to dominate his life. If you go back and look at David's military career, you find that chapter 10 in 2 Samuel is his last military victory. From that time on, Joab is doing all his fighting for him. And so David basically is, he's probably getting old, and that's the difference. So is Joab. Excuse me. Joab wasn't any younger than David, or if he was, he wasn't that much younger than David. And so here is David, who is the king of Israel, saying, hey, I'm too old to fight anymore. I can't do it. Now, I'm not going to knock him for that, because I know that at 50 years of age, I probably wouldn't be much of a fighter. My shoulders don't work very well. If I try to throw a baseball, I can get it from about here to the camera. The pain in my arm when I throw is so excruciating that I don't ever want to throw again. So if I'm trying to wield a sword and try to fight with somebody in a battle at 50 years of age with arthritis in my shoulders, I'm probably going to be a disaster. So probably I should stay home. I don't know how old David was. But, you know, even at that, maybe he shouldn't have stayed home. Maybe he should have done what our generals do. They just stayed behind the front and let the young guys go out in the front and fight and give direction and instructions to be on the battlefield. I'm sure that's what Joab was doing. Joab wasn't right up on the front line. Joab was giving instructions and mobilizing the troops. In fact, when Uriah was killed, Uriah was sent up to the front line, and Uriah was killed in the front line. So, you know, the whole idea of David being at home was really not where he should have been as a king. That's key to understand. For chapter 12, 27 to 29 is interesting, because it shows Joab's growing concern about David as a leader. Let's just take a quick look at it. Chapter 12, verse 27 says, Joab sent messengers to David, saying, I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise I will take the city, and it will be named after me. So apparently David left his palace, came back out to the battlefield, and mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. He took the crown from the head of their king. Its weight was a talent of gold. It was set with precious stones, and it was placed on David's head. He took a great quantity of plunder from the city and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labor with saws, with iron picks and axes, and he made them work at brickmaking. He did this to all the Ammonite towns. Then David and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. So here's a situation where Joab was doing the battle, and David was home. And finally, Joab's pretty much got it wrapped up. Says, hey, they don't have any water now. They're going to die pretty fast. Come on out, and you can do it. And so David did, and he came out and finished the battle. Again, this tells us that David is not paying attention to his knitting, that he's got other things on his mind, that he's not really committed to doing his work. Obviously, his problems with his family was part of the reasons why he was involved the way he was, but perhaps if he'd been doing the work that he had, he would have been more successful. I already mentioned in our devotional time self-pity, so I'm not going to talk about this. But the next thing I want to focus on is David's poor judgment. David did not deal with Absalom in a way that would have been wise. Chapter 14 verses 32 and 33 give us a clue to this. In fact, let's go back a little bit, because I want to show you something of Absalom's attitude. It says in verse 28, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king. Now notice that. What did Absalom do? Okay, what does that mean? Who's in charge?
Absalom.
Not Joab. I say, Ray, come here. Who's in charge?
Absalom.
Me, that's right, okay? So Absalom says, Joab, come here. So notice what happens. Joab refused to come. Joab knew what was happening. Joab wasn't a dummy. He knew very well what was going on. And so he sent a second time. Joab, come here. And Joab refused again. Then Absalom said to his servants, look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house, okay? Now, basically, Joab's got a new car, so go burn down his new car. Burn it up. Then maybe he'll come. Well, Joab came right away. Why did you burn my field? He's very upset. He has every right to be upset. It's the whole year's harvest, Absalom was telling him, I'm in charge. Now, if you look at Absalom's attitude, you see it's arrogant. It's, I am in charge, you come to me. Very aggressive, very aggressive. And Joab did go to Absalom's house. Absalom said to Joab, look, I sent word to you and said, come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death. Hear the arrogance? See what he's saying? Now notice what David does. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Did David do what was wise? No. This man was extremely arrogant. He basically said, David, if I've done anything wrong, kill me. He'd obviously done something wrong. He'd murdered his brother. He knew it. David knew it. He was asking David to punish him or accept me as I am, the one who's going to take over your throne. And that's exactly what David did. He accepted him as the one who was going to take over his throne. David conceded right there. When he bowed to Absalom, Absalom came and kissed him, yes, but it was not the kiss of a loyal son. It was the kiss of an arrogant rival who was going to take the throne away from him. And what you see in the next chapter is absolutely what happened. For 4 years, Absalom was outside the city then, undermining David. So David used poor judgment. He should have banished Absalom back out of the Jerusalem. He should have done what he should do to murderers. Or at least say, Absalom, I refuse to see you. I will not see you. You are a disgrace to me and my family because of what you've done with your brother. But to follow this and to allow him to gain this kind of entrance and this kind of acceptance with his arrogance and with his power play was just to feed right into his hands. Amy?
Yeah, I feel this is the weakness of a people-oriented person. Sometimes they're so affected by their emotions and relationships, and they will lose that kind of judgment versus the task-oriented people. They can still be very rational, and when they face that relationship will push aside, and they can still, make a right judgment.
I think you're right. David we've described as being people-oriented. And of course, he did love his son. You see this all through this. And I empathize with David in that. It's very, very difficult to reject someone you love and to discipline someone you love. It's a very, very difficult challenge to do it. And so, even though this was poor judgment, the context of it was difficult for him. Okay, as we look at where we're going here in terms of working toward a conclusion, David also seemed to be blind toward the rivalries among his sons. Somehow he didn't tune in to the problem with Amnon, And when Amnon did this terrible thing, David should have punished him instead of waiting a couple of years for Absalom to do the murder. You know, David should have handled that. Absalom shouldn't have had to take care of that. David should have disciplined Amnon for this, and he really didn't do it. David just didn't seem to pay attention to what these men needed and didn't seem to know how to deal with them and to work with them. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed as I look at David is that David was a rather poor father. Saul was a much better father than David was. You don't find Saul's sons ever trying to kill him. You don't find Saul's sons in rivalry and hostility with him. You don't find Saul's sons killing one another or engaging in hostile competition to one another. Jonathan, right up until the time of his death, was loyal to his father and loyal to David. Jonathan was a character, a marvelous character, a person of integrity, of deep integrity. And so if you look at the difference between Saul's sons and David's sons, you see that David was a disaster as a father. He wasn't effective in terms of his parental leadership.
Well,
Andy.
I think that Absalom, well, let me back up a little bit. I think that children respond to their parents, that if there is any sort of interaction, the parents have to initiate it, because children are, from birth, just begin to respond to their parents. And Absalom hated his father. There was hatred there. He would have done what he did.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes me wonder, what did David do to make Absalom hate him so much?
Yeah, we don't have any of that data. We just don't see in the scriptures the dynamic that went on. But obviously, there was that, somehow there wasn't the mentoring. In fact, one of the things that you'll notice is that Absalom was not a good fighter. And this tells you that David didn't take him out and teach him. That Saul took Jonathan out to war. And Jonathan learned to fight at his father's side. But David didn't teach his sons how to fight. Absalom was a disaster on the battlefield. That was David's salvation. We'll see that as we go on in the next hour. That because Absalom didn't know how to fight, he didn't have experience in warfare, he wasn't well trained on the battlefield, he made all kinds of blunders, and David won. But that tells us again about David's parenting, that he wasn't effective in taking his son along with him and teaching him to fight. Well, the last thing we have is David failed to respond to the advice of his supporters. Joab uses deception and Ahithophel defects because they were disappointed with David's leadership, and David wouldn't listen to them. As you look at Ahithophel, he's an interesting case study, because Ahithophel was an extremely wise man. And in fact, in the next chapter, it says that Ahithophel's wisdom was like one who had direct contact with God. He was considered to be so wise and so astute in terms of his understanding that everybody recognized his just profound wisdom. And when Absalom went away and set up his own kingdom, Ahithophel, David's counselor, left David and went to be with Absalom. So this tells you that Ahithophel figured that David was finished, that David had lost it. He didn't have wisdom, he didn't have good judgment, he wasn't an effective king anymore. And Ahithophel, who was an extremely wise judge, decided that it was best to go with Absalom. Absalom would be the future king of Israel. Well, we'll see the story of what happened in that as we look at the crisis and conflict that occurs in our next lecture in the next chapter. But David's failure to listen to advice is a common failure among leaders. I remember a story that was written by Don Richardson called Lords of the Earth. And I don't know if you've ever read that book, but that book is about an Australian missionary who absolutely refuses to take advice from Christian leaders. And this is one of the classic flaws of people involved in ministry, particularly sometimes what we might call Lone Ranger missionaries. They really are so convinced that they are right and so convinced that they know that they should do, that they just won't take advice from others. And anytime you become arrogant, anytime you feel that you really know what's going on and you don't need the advice of your counselors, you're in trouble. Wise counsel is crucial for every one of us. And it's an important way to continue to build support. Now, if we look at the issue of raising support, okay, again, satisfying the demands of your followers, influencing them, persuading them, or coercing them. David failed to satisfy the demands of his followers. He wasn't an effective judge. He wasn't an effective leader. He failed to influence them because he was so concerned about his own interest and self-pitying for his family and for his other relationships that he really even gave up that commitment. And he even lost the power to coerce because he lost the army, he lost the basic support of the people. His whole kingdom fell out from under him because someone else came in and satisfied the people. Someone else came in and persuaded them that David's kingship was really not worth following. Tried to influence them that he'd do a better job, he'd give them what they wanted, and he was successful in doing that. And David was run out of town. Well, I hope that we're not run out of town. I don't want to be run out. I don't want you to be run out. And I want to be sensitive to what we can learn from this passage of Scripture tonight. There's so many key things here that warn us about the kind of things that can undermine us and undermine our co-workers. One more thing about training before we close on this. This passage of Scripture is a very powerful passage to train new Christian leaders, because you can teach them right from this passage what will cause them to fail. And you can help them begin, as they study this passage of Scripture, to begin to see the kinds of things that will undermine them and keep them from being effective leaders. One of the reasons why I like to use biblical case studies is because that's what you are challenged to teach the Word of God, to preach the Word of God. And it's through this Word that we can teach people how to be effective leaders. So keep that in focus. There are tremendous lessons here, and you can pass them on. They're in God's Word. They're not out of anthropology or any other subject. They're part of what the Lord did in the lives of people and how they responded to it. Okay, let's take a break.
And helping to develop authors. We work with authors who have already been published.
Okay. Well, we're at lecture 16. Hope you had a good break. And I enjoyed the cookies. So the last lecture this evening is focusing on the issue of social conflict. If we don't deal with conflict, we've not taken a political approach to leadership, right? Because the political approach says conflict is the key agenda, and we should expect it. Well, in fact, every place that I've ever been, all the people that I've worked with, and the job that I have right now always involves conflict. There are just inevitable situations where people disagree with one another, then that disagreement results in further exchanges, and those exchanges sometimes can become quite vocal, sometimes even violent, but definitely full of feeling and emotion. So conflict is the agenda for the rest of this evening. In thinking about conflict, it's helpful to talk about factions as well, because factions have to do with the way social groups respond to conflict. And we'll do a little bit of thinking theoretically about factions and a little bit of thinking about conflict. Let's start by defining conflict. Conflict is exchange based upon opposition. Now, simple definition, right? Exchange based upon cooperation, we say, is leadership. It's support. If you're a leader, you're leading. If you're a follower, you're supporting. But if we're opposed to one another, then we call that conflict. There are many kinds of conflicts that you can experience in missionary work, conflict you can experience in any kind of cross-cultural service. I remember very specifically a student in one of my classes a couple of years ago who was working with a group called the Sherwood down in Brazil. And she said that one of the biggest problems that she had was the fight between the different Sherwood villagers as to which village she was going to teach in. And these particular villages were located on land that they had actually received from the government, and the land had coffee plantations. So there were valuable resources. They each had to stay on their own land, and they were far enough apart that if she taught in one village, then the kids from the other village couldn't go to school. And so there was quite a bit of rivalry between these two villages, conflict between the leaders, and opposition that focused around her, which village she would live in, and which people she would teach. The disagreements in that situation then came between different localities and over their rival interest. And because they opposed one another in relationship to rival interests, they had these exchanges. Another situation that I became acquainted with a few years ago is a group of Indians called the Terena in Brazil, who are a very large tribe down in the south and who have had a long history of Christian missions. And if you were to try to go in there and work in an interdenominational mission, such as Wycliffe SIL is, and you want all of those denominations to utilize the New Testament that you worked so hard to translate, this becomes a nightmare. Because here you have Catholics, and you have Pentecostals, and you have good Baptist-type Protestants who are all in opposition to one another and who believe the others don't have the truth. And if one of them gets a hold of your scriptures, the other two will reject it. You'd like to see everybody reading the Word of God. So what do? How do you deal with these rivalries? How do you deal with these groups that have a continuous source of conflict and dispute with one another? How do you help them to come together to work together for a common goal of getting the scriptures accepted and used for all the people? This, by the way, is a very common challenge with Bible translation all over the world, whether it's the American Bible Society or Wycliffe or Lutheran Bible Society, to try to get a text that all the churches will use, because there are all of these rival groups and they don't want to talk to each other, much less say that this is a scripture that we all agree upon that we'll use. So it can be a really interesting situation. Now, in thinking about conflict, we can talk about two dynamics, and it's helpful to at least look at these. One of them is external stress, pressure from outside. The other is internal strain, things that happen by the very nature of the community itself. External stress has to do with just open political conflict, things that come from outside the community that you're working in. There was a group in Brazil called the Rugbaksha who were kind of the pawns of some outside political forces. There was a group of political activist missionaries from an organization called CIMI, which is kind of a liberation theology organization in Latin America, and particularly in Brazil. And that group wanted to be sure that these people followed their agenda for both the Christian faith and for the political liberation of these Indians from the oppression of the larger society. And then there was the government organization called the FUNAI, which has at its goal the servicing of these people and providing for them within the context of the national government and the national culture. And then there were various churches that bordered around on the fringe of the Rugbaksha Indian reservation who had interest in evangelism and in bringing Indians into their sphere. And so you have this tremendous external rivalry. Well, these put a great deal of pressure on the people. The people have to decide which group they're going to follow. Who has the right idea? Which one should we support? And ultimately in this, there was a great deal of pressure upon the community, and the liberation group won. They took over and kind of dominated the society and all that went on within it. The idea then of external stress focuses on political pressure from the outside, political agents from the outside, and people responding to that pressure and trying to figure out how they can survive within that context. Internal strain focuses on the idea that disagreement comes from within in terms of contested group goals. For example, there may be some people in the community who want one agenda and some people want a different agenda. For example, here at Biola, we always have internal strains. We have disagreements over how things ought to go. We have strains between the 4 schools in the university. Every school thinks that all the other schools get a better deal than they do in terms of the budget. And so they wonder why it is that this school has somehow a hand in the provost's back pocket and none of the other schools can get their hand in it. Well, of course, that's false. Nobody has their hand in my back pocket, and if they did, there's nothing there anyway. So, you know, but you look at the other situation, you somehow see them having some advantage over you, and somehow your particular group isn't getting what you think it should get. The biggest strain and rivalry here is between the graduate and undergraduate programs and graduate and undergraduate faculty. And they both tend to feel that the other side gets the advantage, that the other side has more benefits and so on than they do. You don't find that in intercultural studies because the faculty teach at both levels. They all teach graduate and undergraduate courses, but in some of the other schools you have a clear demarcation between them, and some faculty don't teach any undergraduate work and others teach only undergraduate work, so that tends to produce that kind of division. So these disagreement over means and disagreement over resources creates strain from within inside. That's part of the process of how conflict operates. Now, factionalism is when those stresses and strains produce cleavages or breaches in the social system, in the social relationships. The society breaks up into interest groups, and you have factions developing within that framework then. Anytime you have serious conflict, you usually have factions resulting from it. These factions are usually in response to the fact that some people feel the pressure more strongly than others. Or they feel certain pressures more strongly than others do, and so they then coalesce around that particular pressure point and they stand in conflict to others. I'm thinking now, for example, of David and Absalom and the case study that we've looked at in the last hour. What really was going on at that particular point in time besides this rivalry? My guess is that David was not effective in administering justice. That somehow the system of handling disputes locally was not working as well as it should have worked. And so Absalom was able to stand outside the gate and meet people coming in because the rural justice system wasn't working. In other words, people were coming to Jerusalem because the judges out in the country weren't doing their job right. And somehow David wasn't able to clean that up, and so you got people coming into Jerusalem looking for justice, and Absalom intercepts him at the gate and says, if I were the king, I would be able to do it for you. There are obviously social problems. There's something wrong that people are so ready to follow Absalom and dump David as king. There's something happening there that's not being taken care of. So there is internal strain and pressure from within, and this causes decrease in cooperation. There could also be external pressure, but we don't see it. In other words, it looks like at this particular point in Israel's history, the battles with the outsiders are finished. Now, knowing Israel's history, I'm not surprised at that, because as long as there were battles from outside, Israel was unified. Even back into the Judges period. When they were really stomped on by outsiders, they finally came together and began to cooperate together. But as soon as the outside opposition is over, then the internal pressure to break them apart comes back. And it seems like that's what's happening here with Absalom, that internal pressure now is erupting again. And perhaps it's because David has been so successful, or Joab has been so successful militarily, that now you have internal factions dividing the group. At any rate, those are some of the dynamics that work there. Just take a look at, for a couple of minutes, at the organization of factions. What are the dynamics that are operating with people in terms of how factions operate? Number one, factions are groups. Okay? They form into some kind of a cohesive group relationship. But it's a conflict group as opposed to a corporate group. Now, when you think about a corporate group, what does a corporate group mean? You understand the idea of corporate group? We haven't really discussed that. It's a social organization concept. What does a corporate group mean? Okay. Unity? Common goals? When you think of corporations, what do they have that's different from a church? Well, a church isn't a real good example. From the class like this. What does General Motors have that we don't have as a class? Resources, okay. What else?
Structure.
They've got structure.
Authority.
They've got profit, they've got money, they've got manufacturing plants. Okay, you see they've got a whole host of office buildings and factories and equipment and the capability to manufacture. They've got money to do it with. There's a tremendous variety of resources there. So a corporate group has resources and buildings and property and substantive kinds of materials. And a corporate group exists over time. General Motors is older than any of us here, isn't it? As a company, it's older than all of us. And so it has endured through time longer than the life of any person in this room. So in looking at a corporate group, you see, has this cohesion over time. It has resources. Now, a conflict group, a faction, lacks cohesion over time, and it usually doesn't have any corporate resources. A faction is basically a group of angry people. Now, usually, a faction arises around a charismatic leader like Absalom. Absalom said, hey, you guys follow me and I'll take good care of you. Okay, they say, hey, well, that sounds good. But he didn't do anything. You know, until that day when he went out to declare himself king, and then gather together an army. And then he did a whole bunch of things that rallied people around him, and they decided, hey, this guy can do it. Now, the key thing about a faction is that it organizes and mobilizes conflict. Let's go back and take just a quick look at some of the things that Absalom did to actually organize and mobilize conflict.
That's another whole subject. If you buy a grammar checker and you like it and it includes your writing, that's great.
Let's see. In looking, I can't find it now. Okay, over in chapter 16. Actually, it's in chapter 17. You have Ahithophel in 16 and in 17 advising Absalom. In verse 21 in chapter 16, Ahithophel says, lie with your father's concubines, whom he's left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you've made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of every one with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. Now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Now, in this situation, what I want you to see is that Absalom not only had himself declared king, he then brought these advisors around him, and then he did this act in public in Jerusalem to let everybody know that he was a stench in his father's nostrils. He basically said, hey, my father is nothing. You know, I am the king now. I can do what I please. Now, the custom in those days was that when a new king came in, that he would take the wives and the concubines of the previous king and do with them as he pleased. And so this is what Ahithophel advised him to do, and this is what he did. In this situation then, he is consolidating his force, if you will. He's gathering people together. They're engaging in action together. In effect, Ahithophel is advising him how to organize, how to get his conflict going. Now, Ahithophel gives him some more advice in chapter 17, we're at 1. I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. Look at that, 12,000. So obviously Absalom's got some people around that he can rely on and call. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I will strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. Notice that. Strike down only the king. Bring everybody else back. Don't hurt anybody else. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. Okay. So in this process, what you have is Ahithophel helping him organize. Ahithophel giving him counsel as to how to get this thing going, how to make his move, how to be successful. Basically, leaders like Absalom mobilize people that are unhappy, get them together in a conflict situation, and help them to move forward and to do the job. Now, Absalom didn't really have a long-term power base. He didn't have a palace. He didn't have a tax system to pay for his army. He really didn't have a legal system to punish people if they didn't obey him. He was really just moving fast and trying to pull together some people that would work with him in this moment of opportunity. It was really a faction leader trying to take power away from David and Israel. Now, if he could consolidate that, if he could be successful in war, then he's got a power base to work from, and he's no longer, he takes over his father's concubines, then takes over his father's palace, then he becomes one with property, and he now becomes a corporate leader instead of a faction leader. But at this point in time, he's a faction leader. That is helpful, at least in terms of trying to understand something of the process by which people organize factions and by which they work. Just another comment about factions. The number of factions depends upon the abilities of leaders to control resources and the prior political structure. Factions are very prominent in India. If you were to go to India today for ministry, you would find that the political system is extremely factionalized. The dynamic of local politics is based upon key leaders who are able to influence and get a bunch of other people to follow them. And the church works that way. The church tends to follow a dynamic leader and operates in a factional kind of framework. That society just seems to feed on factionalism. And it's very susceptible to that kind of dynamic and that kind of leadership. There are other societies that don't work that way at all. For example, I know Amy is doing some research on truck. And if you go back and look at truck just does not follow factional leadership. The truckies are so involved with their kinship groups, and the group is so strong that you just can't break those groups up into factions to follow one dynamic leader. If the leader is not somebody that the people recognize, they don't follow him. The leader has to respond to the people. They have to get consensus. Without consensus, the leader can't do anything. And so factions just don't work well in that context. It's not a context that's susceptible to factioning. Now, it can happen. It can happen if there are pressures that come from within a clan, and those pressures build up to the point where people just can't seem to get along with one another. Then it could be that there would be a leader emerge in each group, but again, it would be consensus within those groups. They're very, very strongly group-oriented, and kinship is a dynamic power. So in some situations, factions develop readily. In others, it's much more difficult to get them mobilized. If you go back into the period of the judges, you find that Israel was just full of factions. You come into David's time, and David had pretty much stomped them out, but they emerge again in this context. John?
Is it common for factions to develop into solid organizations?
In a society that has pretty strong group cohesion, factions usually end up in organizations or they disappear. But in India, where you have a tremendous dynamic that produces a lot of population movement, a lot of potential rivalry and dynamism within the nature of communities and groups, and particularly in the urban areas, factions seem to be just endemic, and they don't form solid groups. They tend to be much more fluid. If you remember the article you read earlier on Poor Man, Rich Man, Big Man, Chief, the comparison of Melanesian leaders and Polynesian leaders. Melanesian, the whole system is factions. The whole system is based upon one leader being able to mobilize support and getting a larger number of followers, and then somebody else being a rival and trying to attract some of those leaders away. The whole thing feeds on a factional organization. Factions usually are much more dynamic, where individualism is a greater component in the social structure. And factions usually are less capable. They usually end up in groups in situations where a group is pretty strong and cohesive.
I know a lot of denominations have started first as conflict groups, it seems like.
Yeah.
And then here in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. You remember the grid and group model? Okay. In the low grid, high group, factionalism is very prominent. And the reason for that, it doesn't have a grid structure to tie it together. This is the egalitarian box, the one on the bottom on the left. Okay, if you think of the four boxes. Here, let's put it up. We can just draw a little picture here. Okay, we're talking about this box. It's egalitarian. This is high grid. This is low grid. This is low group. And this is high group. So here you have the egalitarian groups. They tend to be small. When they get large, they break because they don't allow a leader to emerge. The whole group has to work in consensus. And if it gets so big you can't get consensus anymore, then it breaks into 2 smaller consensus groups. And so they continue to break in that dynamic. Up here you can have factions occurring, but because you have a hierarchy, the hierarchy tends to hold the groups together, to pull them together within a framework of structure. And so it makes the situation work. But this is a corporate situation we talked about before. Here you have hierarchy without the intense corporateness, and factions are much more prevalent here, and factions are very prevalent here as well. Here the factions break into groups. In these 2 quadrants they follow individuals, and the individual leaders become very important. My church grew out of that kind of an organization, and we split about every 30 years. In fact, we just are going through another split this year. It's interesting, not my local church, but my denomination. And you go back and look at the history of it from almost 300 years. About every 30 years there is another split in the organization. It gets too big. And they then usually disagree. They have a conservative faction and a progressive faction, and they split on the basis of that divide. And it's just almost a pattern that you can predict. And that's what happened this time. A conservative faction broke off from the progressive faction. So it shouldn't be surprising, because you look at the way they're structured in small groups, very egalitarian. They don't like a hierarchy. They wouldn't want to have a hierarchy. It's a congregational type organization, a fellowship of churches that are very loosely tied together, and loosely enough that when there's a disagreement, progressive and conservative, they split again. Now, if they had a hierarchy that tied them together, that would be much more difficult, because the hierarchy holds the resources. For example, the Presbyterians, the resources are held by the Presbyterian Church of America, not by the local congregation. And so the local congregation says, forget you. They say, okay, goodbye. The building belongs to us. And so the hierarchy keeps the property, and the people that are disgruntled leave. But here, the local church is the holder of the property. The local church has the freedom to do what it pleases, and so basically even the local church can split. And then it becomes the contest over who gets the property. Usually the majority does.
Is that why the Catholic Church doesn't go through these kinds
Oh,
of
yeah.
schisms?
Yeah, exactly. You see, the Catholic Church contains schism very well, because the hierarchy is all-encompassing. And it reaches out and holds all these things within it, and it can have all kinds of tensions within it. If you look, for example, the difference between the Jesuits and the Franciscans or the Dominicans, they have very, very different philosophies, but they all are encompassed within the structure, the hierarchy of the church. And so it can actually contain a tremendous amount of dissonance and still retain its corporate entity and its corporate essence, if you will. Whereas these kind, they continually fragment and break up, and they can't maintain a cohesion at all. It's just not possible because of the way they're structured. Okay, in looking then at factions, you need to understand it's a dynamic of conflict. That's really the key. It's not something that I think we need to be always worried about spiritually. Sometimes we say that, oh, we're having a fight. It's terrible. The church is in bad shape. We're all in a conflict and everything is going to break apart. Why do I say that? Well, Paul says that we should strive to have the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Okay, so I'm not going to contradict that. But if you look at Paul's practice, he and Barnabas had a pretty rousing dispute over whether or not they should take Mark, and they split on that basis, and the ministry expanded. Okay? Paul had a pretty rousing dispute with people in Jerusalem over the issue of whether or not the Jews circumcision should be carried over the Gentiles or not. And that followed him wherever he went. It was an ongoing conflict. There was continuous rivalry between them. Paul had to deal with that rivalry. It was something that was an ongoing part of his work. There were rivalries in the church at Corinth, and he dealt with those always. There's constant rivalry, division. This is part of the situation. The key thing that you have to worry about is not the fact that there are disputes and that there are rivalries, but that the carnality that people have becomes an issue in these disputes. That's what you need to worry about. See, I think the dispute between Paul and Barnabas is a good one. The evidence of that is that it was not a carnal dispute. There was a genuine disagreement about this fellow Mark and whether or not he was going to be useful. And Barnabas was right and Paul was wrong. Paul so much as confesses this later when he asks that they send Mark to him, because Mark has been a real blessing to him and a joy. But, it was better for them to go separate ways. And so the Lord used that to multiply the workers. That's what God can do. So don't be afraid of factioning, and don't throw up your hands in despair when it happens. Say, oh, everything is falling apart. Recognize that conflict is part of ministry. How you handle it, whether you handle it in the Spirit or whether you handle it in the flesh, is really the issue. And if people handle it in the Spirit, then they can work through these difficulties. Sometimes it will mean going in separate directions, as Paul and Barnabas did do, but it won't mean the destruction of either ministry. But when it's based upon carnality, then what happens is the ministries collapse. They don't go anywhere. They die. There's no life in what follows, because each of them are motivated by carnal motives, and their carnal motives drag them down and keep them from being effective instruments of the Spirit. So the real issue is not conflict. The real issue is carnality. And if carnality is at the root of conflict, then you have a problem that will destroy your ministry. Okay, let's go on. I want now to come back to David and Absalom. Amy made a comment at the break that I thought was a very good comment. And that is that probably one of David's big problems was carnality. That David was very likely out of fellowship with the Lord at this point in time. That he really wasn't responding to God's Spirit. He wasn't doing what God wanted him to do. In fact, the evidence that we have from the Scripture indicates that that's exactly where David was. It doesn't say anywhere in these texts that David was on his knees before the Lord, that David was repentant for what he had done, that David was seeking the Lord's face, that he wanted the wisdom of God in relationship to his son Absalom. It doesn't say that anywhere. So my guess is that David was having a bout of carnality, that he really hadn't enjoyed a full restoration of his fellowship with God after his sin with Bathsheba. He was more interested perhaps in his new marriage than he was in his walk with the Lord. And so whatever happened, David really wasn't right with the Lord at this point in time. Now, there are some interesting comments in the text that I think are helpful in understanding this. When David is on the run, David is heading out of town, we find that David gets cursed. The text is in chapter 16, and the verse that I want to focus on is verse 9. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But the king said, "What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why did you do this?'" David then said to Abishai and to all his officials, "My son, who is of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today." So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went, throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Now, this story is a fascinating story. I would encourage you to read it. We don't have time to read it all this evening. But in this one text, you see David responding with his integrity again. You see him coming back once more and talking about the Lord and the justice of the Lord. And what he's saying is, I deserve to be cursed. He's saying, if God wants to have this, then God will do it. And don't cut off the man's head because he's cursing me, that this obviously is God's will, and so let's let it happen. Now, this is the first time when you really see David in a truly repentant mood. in which he is focusing on the Lord again, in which he's accepting the negative as God's correction in his life and as God doing something that is good. To me, that's a very positive sign. And that's really, I think, the key. And again, this is an important passage to teach young leaders. That when we're in trouble and when we are being cursed by people, take it as direction from the Lord, getting you on the right path again, straightening you out, helping you to see what you need to see. That this correction is oftentimes what we need to stay on the path and to do what God wants us to do. David received it that way, and he responded in that way, and I think that's important. Now, in thinking about the dynamics behind this whole thing, we've already talked about the kind of things that led to the revolution. We see that we have Absalom now reacting against David. There are a couple of other factions that really grow out of this. When David emerges as a weak king, then Absalom is finished, but right after Absalom there comes a fellow named Sheba. That's in 2 Samuel verse 20. He goes to the same group that Absalom did, the Israelites, and he leads another rebellion against David. And so you see, David's obviously got a problem. And the problem is in the northern kingdom Israel. And Sheba takes advantage of it. Again, I'm not going to take time to read this passage, but if you go take a look at chapter 20, you see the story of Sheba. And Sheba was killed. The whole battle was finished pretty quickly, and that rebellion was put down. But then after David dies, or just before David dies, Adonijah decides that it's his time to make a move. And he determines to be the next king in Israel. And he recruits Joab. And you find this in 1 Kings chapter 1. And Adonijah tries to set himself up as king just like Absalom did. So there is apparently some kind of a vacuum in power here. There is a sense that David is failing, that he's not able to lead. And so each of these men tries to step in and take over in this particular case. I think it's just helpful to see that when people sense a vacuum of power, it encourages factionalism. It produces people who feel that they can take over and they can replace the leader who is there. Now, how do you respond to that? What do you think?
Never thought of training either predecessor or succeed him.
Okay, you've hit on a key point. Where David failed was he did not early on select his successor, work with that successor, empower that successor, provide for that successor a sense of security, a sense of confidence in the people, to build for his succession someone who could rule in his place with honor and with dignity. It's fascinating. He doesn't bother to get around to this until the last minute just before he dies. And it's a crisis in which Bathsheba comes running in and Nathan comes in and says, hey, Adonijah's already made himself king. Is he the one you want to be king? Oh, no. And so David then quickly goes out and anoints Solomon king. And Adonijah then is chased down and runs into the temple and grabs a hold of the horns of the altar to save his life. And, it's a crisis situation. Well, David could have dealt with this earlier. Amy's absolutely right. He could have worked at bringing his successor in with him, in gradually increasing his power, building his confidence, but he didn't do that. Part of that may be his desire to cling to it himself. This is something you find in leaders. So often they want to cling to their own leadership and to their own power and don't want to train a successor, don't want to move people into it to be the successful people they want, to be a successful follower. So that's one good point. Got another one?
I was just thinking, is that part of the problem? Perhaps in missions, the transition of leadership, the person in power doesn't want to let go and let the, say, national leader have the access to all the resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, that's right. If you have a mission leader who doesn't want to let go and who doesn't want to release resources and release power to national leaders, you promote rivals. You actually produce factionalism. It's inevitable that that will happen because people get frustrated after a while, particularly if you've been involved in leadership training and then don't let them take over and lead. You know, I've watched this happen so many places in the world where you'll train leaders and then expect them to wait until they're 70 before they can become leaders. And you train them when they're 30. Well, you know, 40 years is a long time to wait. You know, and I've been trained, I'm ready to work. What do you want me to do? And somehow the process of bringing them in, discipling them in really meaningful leadership relationships and releasing them to do the job, it doesn't happen. And so that creates this kind of situation that David was in. Good one. Anybody else? How do you deal with this kind of situation?
I think you recognize that there's differences between individuals too. And David was able to pull it off. But the organization is going to change with a different leader.
Okay.
It was different under Solomon. As David's leadership was different than Saul's, and the organization changed. Also with mission leadership, especially when expatriates are being pulled out and nationals are taking over, very often it's an organization that it works under a Western leader. I mean, they probably structured it just the way it was back home, but it's a structure that just doesn't quite fit culturally, and they're going to have to rework that organization.
Okay.
Prayerfully without tearing the whole thing apart, but there should be a sensitivity that it's not going to be the same way, and when they come in, they are going to change some things. And when that takes place over a period of years, it makes missionaries incredibly uncomfortable.
I think it's helpful to go back to the concepts of government and regime that we talked about earlier. If you remember those, regime had to do with the rules of the game, okay? Whereas government are those people that run it. And if we put up the idea of regime here and government, there's an interplay between them. And what Murray is saying is right, that when you have a change in government, that government influences the regime, wants to change the rules, adapts the system so that it can more effectively serve that particular government. And so every time you have a government change, you have rollover in leadership, new leaders coming in, they bring in their own team. That team will in some way affect the rules of the game and how you play. So there is this interplay. The regime does have a longer life than the government, and the rules do persist over time, but there is this interplay and it has to happen. And as we think about leadership change, if we're unwilling to allow that to happen, if, for example, David wanted to keep all the power focused on him and in his hands, and not adapt the regime to the changing personnel that had to happen as he got older and was incapable of functioning, then you have an ineffective government. An ineffective government then produces unsatisfied people. He loses support. Okay? And in losing support, then you have rival leaders who come in and try to establish their agendas and take over and accomplish their purpose. So I think these are agendas that will happen. Okay? That's good. I'm glad you made those observations. Keep thinking about that. As we finish up here, let's now take a quick look at how David regained support. As I've done this before in previous years, one of the things I like to do is give the students the chance to go do this Bible study on their own and come back and give us the answers. But this year, I had to do these both in the same night. So I cut out some other materials, and I wanted to do the discussion of the book by Wildowski on Moses. And I think that we'll be happy that we did that and won't regret leaving out those other lectures. But as we look at this, David did get his kingdom back. He did regain support, and there are a number of significant things that he did to accomplish this. So let's take a look and just very quickly try to see what were the kinds of things that he did to accomplish this. If you look in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 32, you'll find that one of the things that he did was to work on getting better information. Now, you remember the criticism I made of David for 4 years, Absalom outside the city of Jerusalem? Just letting things go, not paying attention. David's running out of Jerusalem now, on the run, and he realizes what he has to do to be king. One of the first things is to get information about what's going on. So, in verse 32, it says that David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God. Hushai, the Archite, was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Now you notice this is David's idea. This is not Hushai's idea. Hushai is there in despair. His clothes are torn, dirt all over his head. He's saying, oh no, the whole thing is falling apart. But David says, oh no, it hasn't. You can help me. And so he sends him back into Jerusalem. Now this is, finally we see David as a leader again. We see him understanding what leadership is all about. You've got to get information. You've got to know what the people are thinking. You've got to have some idea of what's happening out there. And so he sends Hushai back. The next thing you see happening is he gets good information. Chapter 17, verses 15 and 16. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priest, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I've advised them to do so and so. Now send a messenger immediately and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the desert, cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Hushai does his job. Not only does he do it here, but if you read earlier in this chapter, he does a wonderful job of countering Ahithophel's advice. I read you the text which gave Ahithophel's advice. Hushai basically comes in and says, oh, you don't want to do that. David is a mighty warrior. He's not going to be out there lying along the river. He'll be hiding in some cave. You won't kill him, and you'll go out there and you'll get involved in a battle, and then some of your guys will get killed, and everybody will think you're defeated. You don't want to do that. You want to get a bigger army. And that's going to take a few days. And so Absalom listens to Hushai. You know what Ahithophel does? That's right. He goes home, gets his house in order, and hangs himself. Now, why do you suppose he did that?
There is no place for him anymore.
Exactly right. There's no place for him anymore. You know, he knew that Absalom was dead. You see, Ahithophel gave him the right advice. And when Absalom followed Hushai's advice instead of Ahithophel's, Ahithophel knew that not only was Absalom dead, that Ahithophel was dead, so he might as well take care of himself. Because obviously when David comes back, you know, Ahithophel was a traitor. He went with the other side. And if Joab didn't get to him first, which Joab probably would have, you know, he figured it was over. There was not much chance. So he just went home, put his house in order, and hung himself. Now, it's interesting that this man was so wise that he understood exactly what had happened to Absalom and said it's over. Even before the battle was fought, even before Absalom went out to war with David, Ahithophel knew it was finished. David was acting like a king again, and Ahithophel knew David. And he knew that David had planted Hushai, but he couldn't convince Absalom otherwise. And so he was aware that it was finished. Well, let's go on. David also had some good people, faithful people working for him. You see this in 17:1, verse 7 to 21. Hushai's advice to Absalom, and I just explained it to you, so I won't explain it more. But there are some young men who are loyal to David, and they carry the information back to David. Hushai in verse 15 told Zadok and Abiathar the priest, okay, they were still loyal to David. They were still back there, okay? Send a messenger. So they send Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who were their sons, and these men are faithful. They escape, they make it through Absalom's lines, they get back to David to give him the message. So that these people who are David's allies are working with him to protect him and keep him going. And again, I mention this because it's really the people who work with you that make it happen. You can't do it yourself. And I'm preaching to myself just like I'm preaching to you here. Because so oftentimes we try to do it ourselves. We try to make things happen on our own, and we can't do it ourselves. We really need the people working with us. We need faithful supporters who are loyal and are willing to try and go out and make this happen. You've got to work on that loyalty. You've got to listen to their counsel. You've got to be faithful to them to be able to get the job done. Now, chapter 18, we see a different David. David mustered the men who were with him, appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out the troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and the third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself surely will march out with you. Now here's a David who's been sitting at home for years, and at this point in time, he's ready to go back to fight again. But by this time, he's a pretty old fella. He's probably in his 70s, and the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care, but you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. So David takes their advice. Okay. You notice that? Before he's not willing to take advice, now he takes their advice, and he stays in the city. It's interesting, and I note this here, putting competent others in charge. You know, it's so crucial to put competent others in charge, to give them the responsibility, to let them run with it, to do the job that they can do. You can't do it all yourself. And if you try to do it yourself, if you don't rely on the competent people who are with you, it's not going to happen. And then I've noted here, listening to their advice and letting them do their job in their own way. I think if there's anything that you can learn from this, that's probably the most important thing to get out of this. I'll confess to you my sin this morning. Okay, I had my leadership team in the office. There are 12 of them, and I divided them up into 3 prayer groups. One had 5, and there were 13 of us, so there were 4 in each of the other groups. Now, my prayer group, we took some basic time and we meditated on a passage of Scripture and we went right to prayer. The prayer group right behind me, they kept talking and talking and talking and talking. I sat there, I got irritated. You know, I thought, why don't these guys get to it and start praying? You know, this isn't a social time, it's a prayer time. You know, why aren't they praying? And it was kind of irritating to hear them talking. We're trying to pray, and I couldn't concentrate on prayer anymore. I was getting so critical about the other team there who weren't praying like we were praying. And suddenly I realized that, you know, there's more than one way to pray in a group. And maybe some people need to talk more than we needed to talk about the issues. And just let them go. Let them do it the way they have to do it. And you know, they were the last ones to finish. And they were finished later than the time that I finished and the other group finished. But what's the big deal? You know, why is it that I'm going to get so upset when they didn't pray in the same schedule that I prayed on? Have you ever done that? Have you ever done that? You know? And really, you have to let people do it the way the Lord is leading them to do it. You have to release them and swallow your frustration and give it to the Lord and let Him work in their lives. And let Him do the thing that He has to do. It's His work, it's not ours. I have to confess to you that I felt like getting up from prayer and rebuking those guys, saying, hey, you know, we're supposed to be here praying and you guys spent the whole time talking. Fortunately, the Lord stopped me and said, hey, you know, I'm working here. It's my work, it's not yours. You know? And they were praying when I got up from my knees. You know, they were praying. They were doing it the way the Lord was leading them. And I'm sure that number one, I lost the blessing of the Lord because I was concerned about how they were doing it. And so probably the person who got the least out of prayer this morning was me. You know, I let my own attitude destroy the prayer. Now I share that with you because I want you to see that who was hurt? Me. And if I'd let go to that, I would have also hurt my leadership. I wouldn't have been effective. I would have been preachy. I would have been trying to make everybody do it my way. And they would have felt bad. Sure, they would have felt bad if I had said something. But would it have really made a difference? Probably not. It would have not encouraged them in the Lord. It wouldn't have helped them to have a deeper relationship with the Lord. It would have only been painful. So in thinking about this, we've got to release people. We've got to let them do it their way. And, you know, keep on, you know, my responsibility is to keep prayer and meditation before them. But how they do it and when they finish and what the dynamic process is, let it up to them. You know, and not worry about how it happens because that's God's work, that's not mine. My leadership is to be sure that I as a leader set an agenda for prayer and set an agenda for following and reading the Scripture. But how it happens and how it works out, that really has to be for these people to decide and do it themselves. Well, there's some other things that David did here that I think are interesting. Evidence that David trusted the Lord. Number one, he sent the ark back. He didn't take it with him. So he was confident in the Lord. He wasn't worshiping the ark. He believed that it was God was going to do this, and it wasn't the ark that was going to save him. Second thing is he left behind his wives and his concubines. That's what got him in trouble in the first place. Preoccupied with these affairs instead of with the affairs of God and with the affairs of the kingdom. And that was a good choice. The other thing is, if you notice, there was prayer against the counsel of Ahithophel. That's important. You know, he prayed that the Lord would confound the counsel of Ahithophel, and then ask Hushai to stay behind and try, and God did it. Obviously, leaving Hushai there was an exercise in wisdom. And then his exercise of self-control when he was being stoned and dusted by Shimei. You know, not reacting with arrogance, with anger, cutting off Shimei's head, which Abishai wanted to do. Again, you see the spiritual quality and character of this man coming back. And it's really his restoration spiritually that is evidence of God working in his life and bringing about the kind of change needed for him to be victorious again. He showed mercy to the opposition and restraint upon those who had rebelled against him. If you have time to read through the full story, you will see that he really exercised wisdom and judgment and respect for the people in the whole process. The last temptation that David has is the temptation to mourn for his son Absalom. When he finds out that Absalom is dead, he goes back into despair again. And he weeps and he mourns. And he disappears into his house, and Joab comes into him and he says, "Listen, the people have just won a victory for you. Wash your face. Come out and thank them for what they've done for you. Don't sit in here and cry about the man who tried to kill you." And David does it. David washes his face, he comes out, he joins in the celebration, he praises the people and thanks them for what they've done. And it's evidence of the transformation in his character, you see. Even though Absalom was a grief to him all of his life, he was willing to put aside that grief and come back and do what was right by the people that had stood so strongly before him in that context. John?
That's interesting, because I'm always inclined to feel that if you're a leader and you're really grieving or really hurting, then sometimes it's better to communicate it to people and just let them know what's happening.
Well, this was obviously not the time to do that because everybody knew that he would grieve for Absalom. That's why nobody wanted to kill Absalom. The fellow that missed him said, "Hey, I don't want to kill him. You know what the king said." And so Joab went and killed Absalom. And so the people expected him to be grieved. That wasn't a surprise. What surprised them was when he came out and rejoiced with them and praised them for the victory that they had won in the battle. So there is a time for grieving before your people, but this one wasn't the time. You know, it was really a time for a victory celebration, because even though Absalom was his son, he was also his key enemy. Well, thank you. Been a good night.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.